one day, to Paddington's surprise, he arrived downstairs for tea, only to find the Browns were holding a party in his honour. All the family were there, Mrs. Bird, Mr. Curry, and Mr. Gruber. "I've brought you a book on paper tearing, Mr. Brown. I thought you might be able to entertain us."
"I like paper tearing tricks. I hope they're good."
Paddington hurried over to the table in order to consult his new book. "The first one, Mr. Curry," he said, "is called The Mystery of the Disappearing Banknote." "I'm afraid I've left my wallet in my other jacket," said Mr. Brown. "And I only have silver," said Mr. Gruber. "I think it's up to you, Mr. Curry."
"All right, but I hope you know what you're doing, Bear."
"Oh, yes, Mr. Curry," announced Paddington. "Mr. Gruber's book has even got pictures showing you how to do it. Now, I take the note, and I fold it in two, then I fold it in two again, then I tear bits out of it." "Oh, dear." His face dropped as he consulted his book. "Then I put it under my hat."
"What are you doing now, Bear?"
growled Mr. Curry. Oh dear, I'm afraid something's gone wrong, Mr. Curry. The banknote was supposed to turn up inside your ear." "Have you tried looking in the other one, dear?" asked Mrs. Brown. "I think I turned over 2 pages at once," said Paddington. "I've done the paper doily trick by mistake."
"What?"
bellowed Mr. Curry.
"Doily? That's my pound note. It's full of holes."
"Don't worry, Paddington. I'll pay. It won't have to come out of your bun money. Anyway, we have a surprise for you. We've had a cable from the Home for Retired Bears in Lima. It seems your Aunt Lucy is celebrating her 100th birthday soon, Mr. Brown." "Fancy being 100, exclaimed Jonathan. "Bears' years are different," said Judy. "They have 2 birthdays a year for a start." "Anyway, we wondered if you'd like to be there." Paddington sat down in order to consider the matter. His mind was in such a whirl. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "I shouldn't say anything," said Mrs. Bird. "Have a piece of cake instead. I made it specially. It's got Bon Voyage written on it. That means we hope you have a good journey." "Thank you very much, everybody," said Paddington. "But if I'm going back to Peru, I think perhaps I'd better go upstairs and pack." "Don't be long," called Judy. "Your cocoa will get cold."
"It'll seem very quiet without you, Bear," called Mr. Curry. "I don't know who'll do my odd jobs for me."
"Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "Oh, well, no more marmalade stains on the walls." "I shall leave them on. I'm not having them washed off for anyone." "Crumbs," cried Judy. "Here he comes again. That was quick." "I've packed my things," announced Paddington, "but I've left my flannel out in case I need a wash before I leave." "You've packed?" repeated Mrs. Bird. "But what about all the stuff in your room?" "I'm only taking my important things," said Paddington. "I shall leave everything else upstairs for safety." Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. "Paddington," said Mrs. Bird, "you'll never know how happy you've made us feel. We thought perhaps you were leaving us for good." "For good?" exclaimed Paddington. He collapsed into a nearby armchair at the thought. "That wouldn't be for good, Mrs. Bird. That would be for bad." "One thing," said Mr. Gruber. "You'll be able to wash Mr. Brown's stains off after all. He can start afresh when he gets back." "I think that's a very good idea, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington. "If I'm going all the way to South America, I expect I shall pick up some very interesting new ones, especially in darkest Peru. I can't wait to bring them back." Paddington stared at the kitchen sink as if he could hardly believe his eyes. "My tooth's gone down the waste disposal," he exclaimed. "I shan't be able to put it under my pillow and get 6pence now." I'm very sorry, said Mrs. Brown. It must have got mixed up with the breakfast things. It was my best tooth, said Paddington. I've cleaned it twice a day ever since I first had it. I don't know what Aunt Lucy will say.
She'd probably say you shouldn't have eaten that everlasting toffee you made last week. It wouldn't have fallen out then.
I think, said Mrs. Bird, we'd better pay a visit to the dentist. We don't want any more trouble. Besides, it's an emergency.
Emergency or not, said Mr. Leach, the dentist, I'm afraid I shall have to charge extra. Bears have 42 teeth. That's 10 more than usual.
I've only got 41, said Paddington. One of mine's been disposed of.
That's still more than I'm used to. Now, take your scarf off, and I'll see what I can do. Nurse? Nurse, where are you?
I do hope we're doing the right thing, said Mrs. Brown. Paddington's never been to the dentist before. I don't suppose Mr. Leach has had bears before, either, said Mrs. Bird. I'd like to know what's going on in there.
You have a large piece of tooth missing, said Mr. Leach. I shall have to make a new gold top for it.
A gold top, exclaimed Paddington. I thought only milk bottles had those. Mr. Leach decided to ignore the remark.
Now, don't forget, he said, this will bother me much more than it does you.
I'm very glad of that, said Paddington.
Yes, well, I'm going to put this piece of wax in your mouth so that I can find out the shape of your teeth. Now, say ah, and when I put it in, take a good hard bite.
I'll do my best, said Paddington.
Ah, very good. Now, once more, and don't forget, from now on, whatever happens, don't let go.
Ah, said Paddington. Ooh, cried Mr. Leach. Ooh, shouted Paddington excitedly.
Ow!
Yelled Mr. Leach. Ooh! Ow! Repeated Paddington, gripping harder than ever.
Ow!
It's no good, said Mrs. Brown. I can't stand it a moment longer. Here, here, agreed Mrs. Bird. What are you doing to that poor bear?
Poor bear, poor bear! What about my thumb? Look! Look at it!
Perhaps you'd like one of these toffees, Mr. Leach, said Paddington. I made them myself, and they're very good for taking your mind off things.
Thank you, said Mr. Leach. Thank you very much.
I wouldn't if I were you, warned Mrs. Bird. Remember what happened to Paddington. Oh, dear, said Paddington. I think Mr. Leach is having the same sort of trouble with his teeth as I was with mine. The sooner you get rid of those toffees, the better, said Mrs. Bird. Paddington put on his injured expression. I'm doing my best, he said, but nobody seems to like them very much. He was about to suggest Mr. Leach tried saying ah, but he seemed to be having enough trouble with his mms, so he thought better of it. Instead, he got ready to leave. I think, he announced, Mr. Leach is the best dentist I've ever been to. I shall always come here when I've had a tooth disposed of. He said it was going to bother him much more than it did me, and he's quite right. It has. Mine feels better already. One day, Mr. Curry entered a golf competition, and he asked Paddington to act as his caddy. Paddington wasn't very keen on doing favours for Mr. Curry. They always seemed to turn out wrong. All the same, he felt most important as he made his way onto the golf course. Especially when Arnold Parker, the world-famous champion who was acting as judge, waved to him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Parker," he called.
Ah, there you are, Bear, exclaimed Mr. Curry. Thought you were never coming. Anyway, now you are here. Keep your eyes open, and remember, I shall hold you responsible if my ball gets lost.
"It's all right, Mr. Curry," said Paddington. "I've marked it with a special marmalade chunk."
Marmalade chunk, snorted Mr. Curry. You sure it won't come off?
"Quite sure, Mr. Curry," said Paddington. "Mrs. Bird always says my chunks stick to anything."
Well, I hope you're right, Bear. This is a very important event. It's to see who can hit the ball the furthest. I don't want my ball getting mixed up with anyone else's. Now, when I go up to collect my prize, I'd like you to... Bear! That's my best club you've broken.
Perhaps you could tie the two ends together, Mr. Curry, said Paddington hopefully.
Tie the ends together?
Bellowed Mr. Curry.
Why,
Is anything the matter? Asked Arnold Parker. Can I be of assistance? Hello, Mr. Parker, exclaimed Paddington. I'm afraid I've been having trouble with Mr. Curry's clubs. You're welcome to borrow mine, said Arnold Parker. Parker, said Mr. Curry. Not the Arnold Parker?
I was only joking, of course, Bear. Remind me to give you 5p when we get home. Now, have you got my tea?
Your tea, Mr. Curry, exclaimed Paddington. You can have one of my marmalade sandwiches if you like. It was fresh this morning. I made it specially.
I mean the sort of tea you put your ball on. I want to address it.
Paddington began to look more and more confused. He'd never heard of anyone hitting a ball off a marmalade sandwich before, let alone writing his address on it. I think, whispered Arnold Parker, your friend means he's ready to go. Paddington was about to take cover when there was a loud cry from Mr. Curry.
Ooh! Bear, I've just slipped on your marmalade sandwich. I've hurt my leg. Now I shan't be able to play.
Perhaps I could do it instead, Mr. Curry. Your old club is just the right length now. Mr. Curry sat up holding his leg. He looked as if he had a lot more to say, but fortunately his voice was drowned by a passing train. 4, shouted Arnold Parker above the noise.
5,
cried Paddington excitedly. Mr. Curry stared at the Browns.
I've won a new set of golf clubs, he exclaimed.
No, said Mrs. Brown, Paddington did, but he's giving them to you to make up for your breaking yours.
His ball went 9 miles.
Arnold Parker says it must be a world record, broke in Jonathan. I bet the engine driver was surprised.
The engine driver? What is everyone on about?
Your ball landed in a goods train by mistake, Mr. Curry, explained Paddington. The driver sent it back from the next station, and Mr. Parker said there was nothing in the rules to stop it being counted. So I won first prize.
Unlike some people,
broke in Mrs. Bird,
bears always fall on their feet.
That's what Mr. Parker said, exclaimed Paddington. He's going to put marmalade chunks on all his golf balls in future. He thinks it might bring him luck. Besides, if he ever gets lost in a bunker, at least he'll never go hungry. One day, Paddington was opening his morning mail when he came across a letter inviting him to a rugby match. It seemed the Peruvian Reserves were playing a charity match against the Portobello Wanderers. You can borrow one of my old rattles if you like, said Jonathan. It had better work both ways, said Mrs. Bird. Don't forget, Paddington's loyalties will be divided. My loyalties are going to be divided? Exclaimed Paddington in alarm. What do you mean? Well, said Judy, you won't know which side to cheer on. Half of you will want the Portobello Wanderers to win, and the other half the Peruvian Reserves. Paddington considered the matter for a moment. Perhaps, he announced, I'll have 2 rattles, just to make sure. Paddington had never been to a rugby match before, and he was most excited as first one side seemed to be winning, and then the other. It's what's known as a compromise, Mr. Brown, he explained.
Sounds like a ghastly noise to me,
said Mr. Brown. But gradually, as things settled down, an air of gloom fell over the ground. It was a hard game, and first one and then another of the Peruvian side were carried off the field with injuries. Paddington grew more and more upset, and he gave the referee several hard stares through his opera glasses. Oh dear, said Jonathan, they don't stand a chance now.
Young Mr. Brown seems to be taking it very much to heart,
said Mr. Gruber. I think he's gone off for a bun. No, he hasn't, exclaimed Judy. Look.
Oh, Lord, said Mr. Brown. Now what?
Excuse me, said Paddington. I've come to offer my services to the Peruvian reserves.
I'm sorry, said the referee, but I can't allow that. It has to be someone from the country concerned.
Paddington gave the man another hard stare. Well, I come from darkest Peru, he said firmly, and I'm very concerned. The referee seemed to go a funny colour. Some of Paddington's stares could be very hard indeed. He looked at the ball, and then at the waiting players.
All right, he said. You can have a go if you like. After all, it is a charity match.
Paddington needed no second bidding. Before the referee had time to change his mind, he picked up the ball and threw it into the middle of the scrum. Then he stood back to await developments. "Thank you very much," he began, raising his hat politely. "Watch out!" cried Jonathan. "Too late," moaned Judy. Paddington sat up. He'd known rugby was a rough game, but never in his wildest dreams had he pictured it being quite so rough, and he could quite see why so many players had been carried off the field. But before he had a chance to say help, let alone get up, the pounding of feet grew louder again.
"Here you are!"
shouted a voice. "Catch!" Paddington fell over backwards in alarm. "I don't want it, thank you very much," he cried. "Oh dear, I can't watch," exclaimed Judy, as Paddington scrambled to his feet and hurried off down the field as fast as his legs would carry him. "Don't worry," said Mr. Gruber. "He hasn't got the ball anymore." "He jolly well has," cried Jonathan. "Look. He had it under his duffel coat all the time. No wonder the other players couldn't find it." "Good old Paddington, he's scored a try. They've won the match, Crikey. What's up?" began Judy.
"Oh. Will someone please tell me what's going on?" said Mr. Brown.
"Oh dear, Henry, look." "Excuse me," said Paddington. "I'd like you to meet someone. It's my Aunt Lucy. She's come all the way from the Home for Retired Bears in Lima with the Peruvian Reserves Supporters Club. And she'd like to stay for a while. That is, if she may." Paddington's first Christmas with the Browns was a day to remember. The night before, on Mrs. Bird's instructions, he'd hung a pillowcase on the end of his bed, and next morning he found to his surprise that it was full of parcels. Paddington liked parcels, and he lost no time in opening them. There was a chemistry outfit, a new scrapbook from Mr. Gruber, and a xylophone. Soon the whole house was awake. "I'm as patriotic as the next man," grumbled Mr. Brown, "but I draw a line when bears start playing the national anthem at 6 o'clock in the morning." "There's no need to stand to attention, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "I'm not standing to attention. I'm stuck to the floor. Look." "Oh, gosh," said Judy. "That must be the instant glue I gave him for his new scrapbook." "Christmas," groaned Mr. Brown. "Perhaps you'd like to give a hand with the dinner, Paddington," said Mrs. Bird. "There's a lot to be done." "I could test your gravy with some litmus paper from my new chemistry set, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "Bears are very good at testing gravy." "See what I mean?" Paddington had never eaten one of Mrs. Bird's Christmas dinners before, but he had to admit it was worth waiting for. The table was groaning with good things. There was an enormous plate of turkey to start with, which he soon polished off. And that was followed by mince pies, which went the same way. But best of all was Mrs. Bird's Christmas pudding with custard. Well, Paddington, what do you think of it? Was it worth waiting for? It was very nice, Mrs. Bird, said Paddington, except I had a bone in my Christmas pudding. A bone, repeated Mrs. Brown. You can't have a bone in a Christmas pudding. I did, said Paddington firmly. It was all hard. I nearly broke a tooth. Mercy me, you know what he's done? Quick, said Mr. Brown, we'd better turn him upside down. And before Paddington had time to say anything else, he found himself standing on his head in a corner of the room. Try jumping up and down, suggested Mrs. Brown. I'm trying to, only it's not easy with paws. Perhaps we could try using a magnet, suggested Jonathan. I've got a great big one upstairs. A magnet, repeated Paddington. I've never heard of a bone magnet before. It's not a bone, said Judy. It's a 5-penny piece. It's supposed to be lucky. If you find it, you can make a wish. Lucky, repeated Paddington. I don't see anything lucky about nearly swallowing a 5-pence. I feel sick. You mean you haven't swallowed it? Mr. and Mrs. Brown looked at each other. Why ever didn't you say? Asked Judy. Nobody asked me, said Paddington. He was about to wish he'd not eaten quite so much Christmas dinner. Then he changed his mind. For really it had been quite the nicest one he'd ever had. So instead he made another wish. Then he pointed to his 5-pence. Perhaps you'd like a go now, Mr. Brown, he suggested. No, thank you. I think perhaps I'll leave it until next Christmas. And the way time flies, it won't be long to wait. That's funny, Mr. Brown. That means my wish is starting to come true already. One morning, Paddington came hurrying downstairs as fast as his legs would carry him, and he burst into the dining room looking as if his very life depended on it. Good gracious, exclaimed Mr. Brown, what on earth's the matter? Look out of the window, cried Paddington. Everything's gone white in the night. Look at it. It's all right, said Judy. There's nothing to worry about. It's only snow. It happens every winter, said Jonathan. Snow, said Paddington. What's snow? It's a nuisance, said Mr. Brown. It'll have to be cleared away before I can get the car out. Don't worry, said Jonathan. We'll do it for you. Come on, Paddington, you can bring your bucket and spade and lend a paw. Paddington decided he liked snow, especially the brown sort. He made several journeys up and down the path outside their garage. Then he turned his attention to the back garden. It was as he reached the fence that an idea suddenly struck him. He was always getting into trouble with the Browns' neighbor, Mr. Curry, and he felt it might be a chance to do him a good turn and clear some of his paths, too. In fact, taken all round, it was a good chance to kill several birds with one stone. Jonathan and Judy were busy making a snowman, so he tipped several bucketfuls of Mr. Curry's snow over the fence in case they ran out. Caught you, yelled Jonathan. Come on, Paddington, let's have a snowball fight. Paddington needed no second bidding. Having a snowball fight sounded even more fun than clearing pathways. Watch out, he cried, it's coming. At least, I think it is. Yeah, missed me by a mile. You'd better get some practice in. Paddington decided that throwing snowballs was much more difficult than it looked, especially with paws. So he thought he would put another plan into operation. On the way up the garden, he did Mr. Curry yet another good turn by closing his back door for him. He felt sure he wouldn't want all the cold air going into his house. Then he crept towards another part of the fence in hope of catching Jonathan by surprise.
Bear! You've been throwing snowballs, Bear!
Snowballs? Repeated Paddington. Did you say snowballs, Mr. Curry?
Yes, snowballs. A large one came through my bedroom window just now and landed on my hot water bottle. It's melted in the middle of my bed.
Oh, dear, said Paddington. I wouldn't do a thing like that on purpose, Mr. Curry. Besides, it'll be much too difficult to get it through a window, especially a large snowball like that.
Like what, Bear?
Like the one you said landed on your bed, Mr. Curry.
Brr. Well, I must say you've made a good start on my snow. I'm going indoors now, but if you do the rest of the garden by the time I'm dressed, I may give you a penny later on.
One measly penny for clearing a whole garden, exclaimed Jonathan. There's no justice in this world. Oh, I don't know, said Judy. Perhaps there is. Look.
Bear, bellowed Mr. Curry, did you shut this door? You've locked me out of my own house. Where are you, Bear? Come back here at once.
I think he may have gone that way, said Jonathan. Or was it that way? Asked Judy. Perhaps, said Paddington hopefully, I might even have gone that way, Mr. Curry. Whichever it was, I'm not coming this way again today.
Look for more Paddington Bear adventures. Collect them all for hours of fun.